Welcome to the Open Talent Report, the award-winning podcast where we dive deep into the emerging trends in global employment, the future of work, the talent crisis, the demographic deficit, and the new world of work with our expert host, Connor Heaney. Connor is the managing director at CXE EMEA, a company that takes the hassle out of finding, compliantly engaging and paying contractors anywhere in the world. In this podcast, Connor brings you captivating conversations with top CEOs, visionary founders, and industry experts. Together, they shed light on all things open talent and the evolving nature of work itself. So grab your headphones and join us on this exhilarating journey.
Hello and welcome to this week's show where I'm delighted to welcome Martin Thomas, Director at Workforce Strategy and also partner at Talent Intelligence Collective. Martin was until quite recently the head of Total Workforce Strategy at Philips and has held senior talent acquisition leadership roles at the BBC, AIG and BT Group. I've wanted to have Martin on the show, although he does not know this, for some time. Martin is one of the pioneers in what has been described as total talent, and wherever I go and whoever I've spoken with about total talent, they've always referred me back to Martin. And I was very lucky to listen and watch as Martin spoke at a number of panels and keynotes at the Procurement event in Berlin recently. And I was very lucky to spend a few times with Martin, begging and encouraging him to come on the show. Martin, a very warm welcome to you. I'm delighted that you're here. Thanks so much for joining us. And how the hell are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Connor. And let me get my thank you in straight away so we don't have an argument later. Thank you very much for asking me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Martin. It's great to have you on. And we've another Martin in common, Martin Hansen, that was on the show some months back. And that was a joy to behold. So, Martin, listen, great to have you on. Love to hear your story, just a pop quiz history of how your career started and how it emerged and how you became involved in total talent. So, Martin, over to you.
Thank you. I got involved in total talent at Philips. I was there for 9 years. I left at the end of December, at the end of 2024. I started a role there as head of TA. That had been my career at multiple companies before. Before that, I'd worked in search as a headhunter and for recruitment companies. And after leaving university, I did a short stint in the military. So I was in the Royal Artillery for 9 years, TA, and 3 years TA and 6 years regular. So I'm a veteran. They say you're quite good at communicating, so that helped me get a job as part of my resettlement. I did a mini MBA. They asked me to apply for a job in the Sunday Times in the days when it was all newspapers. I applied for, I said, which one? Because I was good at following orders in those days. I said, well, it's Thursday, wait till Sunday when the paper comes out. And it was all about transferable skills. So even in those days, skills were important, but transferring your skills from one environment to another, and communication skills, project management, engaging with people were skills of a recruiter. So I applied for a job thinking I wouldn't hear anything more, and got invited for an interview and thought that was a good experience. I got invited back for another interview. That was an even better experience. And then they offered me a job. So that's how I got into recruiting completely by accident. Worked on a number of years on the internal search side, and then moved into those internal jobs that you talked about.
Wow. And Martin, I wasn't aware of your background in the forces and the military. I've had some great experience in my career of working with and hiring people that come from the veterans community, and it always strikes me as an untapped talent pool that perhaps more companies in UK and Ireland and Europe should consider tapping into, because some of the best people from the forces have adaptability. They are self-reliant because in many cases they've had to be, even though sometimes they're told what to do. They're brilliant organizers, can lead and implement and execute projects. And I always think, why wouldn't people hire more from the veteran and military forces community? We hadn't prepped for this, Martin, but just a question for you, really. Do you think that's something that organisations should potentially improve on and look to actually do better on? Because I know there's the Armed Forces Covenant in the UK. I think we've signed up to that last year as an organisation. But can organisations do more on that front to help bring military veterans into the private sector workforce?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I recognise the value. I recognise the skills. I think the reliability thing you mentioned is a key. You generally ask somebody that they understand how to complete a mission, so they understand how to get the work done, get the job done. And I think that pride in doing that job is a really valuable skill that they bring, and they don't ever want to let their teammate down. And that teammate would be their colleagues. I was very happy to help BT become part of that covenant many years ago, to get Philips as a bronze, then silver on the covenant. I think it's a great opportunity just to raise awareness. Maybe it's not even about jobs. Maybe it's not the job for the veteran. It might be for their family. It might be supporting the family while somebody is deployed. It might be just being visible as an environment and help. And of course, creating a network group and an employee resource group, whatever it is, so people who with similar experience can talk about similar stories. So it's not just about jobs, it's about being veteran friendly. As an employer, being flexible in leave, being willing to, recognizing people might get deployed on active service at very short notice and being able to support that, perhaps granting some additional deployment leave. Again, that's both of those companies did that to actively support. I tell you another thing I did though, where it combined two bits from my experience. I was looking after resourcing at BT, and it was the days when broadband was being rolled out. So a few years back, you can tell I've got a few grey hairs now. We needed difference between broadband and copper and telephones is it has power, has electricity going through it. So every cabinet that was copper just had the wires, the power came through the telephone pole. But with broadband, you've got to have power in the cabinet. It's a completely different skill set. Back to skills again. We needed to build up capability now. We did a great apprentice program. We did great graduate recruitment. Fantastic cross-skilling, but we needed more, and we also needed people who would be flexible and willing to move around the countryside deploying broadband literally across the country. We found that people coming out of all aspects of the military had great skills. They were used to dealing with power. They were used to dealing with telecommunications in whatever branch of the military they were in, and they had that reliability and that willingness to be mobile as well. And so we actually created a team that could be deployed on some of our biggest projects, supporting the rollout of NHS spine. They called it the broadband spine of the NHS, as an example where you are literally having to connect hospitals into the network. And we got a great squad of people out of the military who could help do that.
Wow, Martin, I love that story, and I love what you explained about the Armed Forces Covenant as well. I really like what they do, at least up until recently in the United States, around minority-owned businesses, and there's a category for, as I understand it, veteran-owned businesses, and they fall into the minority category, and subsequently organizations that work with the public sector in the United States can get additional market share by engaging veteran-owned or other minority-owned businesses. And I'd love to see something like that in the UK as well. And perhaps that exists already, but I'm not aware that it does. But I think there's something in that.
It's an interesting one. It's an interesting one, isn't it? And the current president, Trump, in the US, has actually gone quite hard against a lot of the DE&I initiatives, including the employee-owned. I was always a little bit skeptical about employee-owned if the focus was just having somebody named. were they really the person that owned the company and delivered the work? More importantly, did they deliver the scarce talent that you were looking for? And did they deliver talent that represented all of the communities that are in the marketplace, are in the customer base? Veterans also in the US, they have some fantastic legislation that says you have to have a certain percentage of veterans. You have to offer targeting job searching against targeted sites that support veterans. So they are much more, they discriminate much more positively towards veterans. That's a piece of legislation I don't think even Trump would dare touch.
No, I think that might impact his base somewhat, Martin. I wasn't aware of that, Martin, and that's interesting. Next time I'm speaking to some of the lobbyists and policymakers in the UK, I'm going to bring that up because I think that's a really great idea that they have, and it's a really great thing that they have over there, and one that we should consider having.
For anybody who's dealing with the federal government, so,
yes,
they have to have a percentage of veterans and positively target veterans in their recruitment process, their recruitment approach.
More of that, I say, Martin. So, Martin, if we can come back to your company at Workforce Strategy, I know until relatively recently you were with Philips on a full-time basis, but what are the typical challenges and problems that you're going to be solving for and are solving for at Workforce Strategy?
What I want to do is to be able to offer, and what we are delivering on projects already now, is to think of a total workforce solution. So think about your workforce in a more strategic way. So if an employee leaves, don't automatically replace them with an employee. If a contingent worker moves on, don't automatically go for another contingent worker. Think about how you can get that work done. Maybe some of it can be automated. Maybe you get bots in there. Maybe you're using AI. Maybe you're changing the way the work is structured. Maybe you're reallocating work in different ways. Perhaps there's also an offshoring element to that. Thinking about where you can get the work done, as well as how you get the work done. And that then makes you think about all sources of skill and capability. And that's where that total workforce piece comes in, because you're thinking about your employees, you think about your contingent workers, your freelancers, your whole external workforce through partnerships and outsourcing. So it's about thinking about a total workforce and being strategic about how you engage and attract that workforce.
Thank you, Martin. And Martin, I've been to a lot of sector or industry conferences, particularly in the contingent workforce space, and there's probably two that seem to dominate globally. There's the Staffing Industry Analysts and there's the Procurement conferences. And I've been going to the Staffing Industry Analysts conferences, which I must admit I do enjoy. For about the last 10 years, and there's been so many conversations around total talent, and a lot of the conversations seem to be over the last number of years negative, whereby the total talent is some sort of unicorn-like thing that doesn't really exist. And then I've been following your work and the likes of Martin Hansen over the years, and I went to Procurement for the first time there last month in Berlin. And my mind was blown because organizations and people like you, Martin, and others were making total talent a reality, right? So there's this sort of dichotomy in the market between people saying, well, it doesn't really exist, or it's hard to achieve, or it's actually happening. And I suppose what I wanted to do today, Martin, for the benefit of our audience, was really to talk around total talent and specifically, what is it? And then how can organizations work to make it happen?
So I tend to talk about total workforce rather than total talent. I think total talent has a place, and a lot of people translate that, and particularly some of the suppliers out there who maybe have an MSP program for their contingent workforce and an RPO program for employee recruitment. And they often will talk about total talent as bringing both of those, having both of those delivering, but both for a client, and therefore they're delivering a total talent solution. And that's very valid. And you get a lot of synergy between engaging with that whole ecosystem of both your contingent workers and your employees. You get a lot of value through a consistent approach and consistent strategy in how you recruit both of those types. But I think you miss a little bit of the wider workforce. So you miss the opportunity to think more strategically, thinking about all the other ways of getting that work done, and also the shape of the work, not just how you recruit once you've got a job spec. So for me, the difference is total talent is about how you get the talent, how do you acquire the talent. Total workforce is around how you think about your broader workforce, how you think about getting the work done, getting it done in the right way, in the right place, at the right cost. The right place brings in that thoughts around total talent availability, salary arbitrage, getting being able to go where the talent is emerging, the talent is found, rather than always putting it in the same place.
This is why, Martin, I couldn't wait to have a conversation with you, because two of the things that you've mentioned there specifically, talent availability, essentially where is the talent or where can the talent be found, salary or labor arbitrage, and then emerging talent. There's some of the most consistent themes that we've talked about in this show over the last 3 years, Martin, and personally I'm hugely interested in them, which is probably reflects the bias why it's come up so often. But the talent availability piece is something that really interests me for two reasons, Martin. The first is a demographic reason. So based on the research that I've undertaken, and of course we've consulted things like the OECD, the European Union, Eurostat, the USA Bureau of Labor Statistics, I think it's called, but we'll name check the correct name. But based on our analysis, it looks like the Western labour markets, with some exceptions, are in a demographic deficit, Martin, and have been, particularly in the case of the European Union, over a 60-year time period. So roughly there's 30% less people available over the last 60 years in the Eurozone. I think it's across 27 states that have been tracked. Not equally, but also by way of comparison, the United States have suffered a similar demographic deficit over the last 50-year period in terms of their birth rate. Right? In short, they haven't produced enough people, same as the Eurozone or the European Union. What saved, I suppose, those economies, particularly the USA, has been inward migration, right? But I suppose what we're seeing now is some restrictions on that. And also in the UK, we've seen Brexit, and it's much more difficult to stay in, or has been more difficult to stay in the UK. So you've got less talent being produced over a long or medium term basis, and then you've got less ability to go into those labour markets as a worker, right? To say, hey, come and hire me or hire my services. And for me, that's fascinating, right? Because for me, that begs the question, well, where the hell do you go to find the talent, right? And I think that's really interesting. Do you go to emerging markets? Do you go to artificial intelligence or automation? Do you go to BPO or outsourced? And for me, that's fascinating. Martin, do you share that same fascination?
I do, absolutely. And you're now talking about the total workforce,
yes,
and total talent. Again, you're thinking about how do you get that work done, and not just doing it in the same way. It's really interesting. You described the birth rates, and you always think about, it's an urn. That's a really bad picture of an urn, but you've got that piece where the birth rate is lower than the most populous part of your demographic. And that's where much of the Western world is. And then you've got some of the emerging countries where they've been a pyramid for a long time, but they're now getting a similar squeeze. In China, because partly due to some of the policies they have about single child, etc. And even now in India, it's starting to squeeze at the base. Now you're looking at other places emerging. Nigeria is going to become one of the largest working populations in the world very, very soon. And there'll be growth happening in many other sectors. You look at the around the world. That's why you're talking about workforce. That's why it's workforce strategy rather than total talent, in my view. You have to think about all of those different ways of getting the work done, deconstructing the work, perhaps having some of it outsourced, having some of it done by a bot, having some of the key bits still done by your workforce. And we've talked about skills a few times as well. Thinking about the skills that you need to deliver that work. Where do you find those skills within your workforce? The most valuable talent that you have is the talent you already have. So making sure that I don't know, I use that word in, that phrase in Procurement as well. I think people forget about their own internal talent, the people that they already have, that they've already invested in, and who have invested in them as well.
I think where and how you find that internal skills or internal talent is crucial. I'm weirdly obsessed with strategic workforce planning, Martin, or resource demand planning. In your view, to make a total workforce strategy effective, how important is it to get that right? And what advice would you have for the enterprise organization that wants to go on a total workforce strategy journey? I suppose they have to set their objectives and all that, what they want to achieve by that. But for organizations that are looking at this or want to look at this, how important is that, what I would consider maybe first piece of the puzzle, which is the demand plan side of things?
So I think that getting the strategic workforce plan in place is critical, but not many of us do it, and not many of us do it well. Lot of the consulting firms, the audit firms, accounting firms, systems integrators can predict the work because they know when audit is going to happen. They know when they've got projects coming. They know what their future demand is going to look like. In some ways, somebody else who's Procurement talked about the Christmas period being the break, the make or break period for the company, and how their resource demand goes up tenfold for a period of 3 months and then drops back down again, and you cannot not deliver the resources that they need in that period because we have the Christmas golden period. And I try to connect strategic workforce planning, talent intelligence, and you mentioned that right at the beginning, understanding where the talent is. That informs all of the aspects of the workforce strategy. That strategic thinking around your workforce, and then the impact it might have on transformation. So how might you transform your TA organization or deploy an MSP or an internal contingent program to deliver that strategy? For me, strategic workforce should come first. It's very hard, and my number one tip would be, if you ever have an Excel involved in your strategic workforce planning, you've just lost the strategic part.
I love that. I think there's been a few organizations I've worked in and work with that started with an Excel. Actually, I remember working with BT years ago, Martin, but it was with their Irish business, which almost operated as a standalone. But their Irish business had a large managed service element to it, and the managed service essentially looked after data centers, NOCs, and other nodes for large enterprises that were headquartered in Ireland at the time and still are. But we worked with them to build them a resource demand planning tool. So we were a staffing company, so we had a database. We'd work with BT to provide them with a whole set of project resources. We were able to work with the BT sales team because that's where the peaks and trough came from. So the BT sales team would go out and sell some huge enterprise deal. They'd come to the delivery team and say, hey guys, can you bloody get us 5 project managers, 4 Cisco engineers, a CCIE, and we all need them next week to start the project. So we started working with the sales team more closely to understand their sales cycle. And yes, initially we started with Excel, but we were able to work. Anyway, I'm getting into too much detail, but I know you'd work for BT, so some of our audience might find that interesting. But it even if it starts with Excel, I agree with your point, Martin. But it got to start somewhere in order to make it successful. But we're able to work with a tool called MicroStrategy. It's a business intelligence tool that was able to suck out the information, that was able to put it in a lovely dashboard in terms of what talent was required, when it was required by, and then that was able to integrate with the database that we had in the back end of resource, and was able then to really serve up a list of who might be available and how much, and then BT would add their margin on top of that, and it was working pretty well, albeit at quite a low volume.
I think you're probably talking about BT Global Services,
yes,
which was
correct.
the items, the international part of BT. That's the bit I first joined.
Yes.
And they are a consulting and systems integrator. They were that example.
That's right.
That type of company where they can predict their projects. They know the resources they're going to need, their demand planning. is critical because that's their asset.
Yes.
They charge for that demand. They charge for the people, the individuals that are delivering that work, whether it's through their own BT people, global services people, or it's through third-party partners. That, I think, is and all of the systems integrators and the consultancies do that. That's where the birth of total workforce and strategic workforce thinking comes from. Because when the service you're providing is the people, if you don't have the people, you can't bill for them. So it's fundamental that you therefore think, well, who have we got internally who's coming up available in 6 months' time for this new project, or where do we have to recruit? Think about that story about rolling out broadband and recruiting out of the armed forces because of the skills they had. That's exactly what we were doing. We were thinking a little bit more longer term about our workforce demand, and using all sorts of sources of skill, sources of data and information to do that. And there are some great talent intelligence providers out there who can give you that sort of insight. You can use tools like LinkedIn and Talent Neuron and many, many others. There's also a lot out there that's free. You mentioned several earlier on in United Nations. World Bank is another one that we've used. We used to model the number of graduates that come out in a country, from engineering and IT graduates, to see where the future potential skill is going to be, and use that at Philips to help inform our location strategy. We take that data, combine it with lots of other data sources, put it into a business intelligence tool you mentioned,
Yes.
And then visualize it to say that this is what's available out there. This is your external part, potential external workforce. Now combine that with your internal workforce. Look, see where the gaps are, where are the overlaps, but where can this external piece augment your internal workforce? And that's, you're starting again to think on a more strategic level about your workforce, and you're thinking more about your strategic workforce planning, and you're bringing in talent intelligence at the same time. And I'm in my happy place.
Me too, Martin. Yeah, like all this, I love this topic of conversation, and I could probably stay on this for quite some time. But just more in the interest of time for audience, we could definitely come back to that if we look at our comments and all that. But I think that it's something that needs a lot more discussion in the wider market. One of the things, though, Martin, I was thinking about was around the constraints that the typical large enterprise might have around a total workforce strategy. So you and I know, and others that are looking at the labour market or the talent availability. So we know roughly by, I think, 2050 that Nigeria is forecasted to have the same population as current European Union, right? So roughly about 400 to 450 million persons. By 2100, if you push that out further, it's estimated that Nigeria will have a population of around present-day China, but somewhere between 1 billion and 1.4 billion people. Whereas, interestingly enough, Martin, the population of China by 2100 is forecast to be around half of what it is today, for the reasons that I think you mentioned earlier. But I suppose my question is, if you're a talent acquisition HR leader or potentially a procurement leader that wants to look at the total workforce strategy, and you're thinking, geez, how do I build a business case? And of course, Martin, we don't want you to give your secret sauce away from your consulting practice and your business, but like, how do you convince, medium-sized bank A or large widget producer B to go, well, actually, we know Nigeria is the direction of travel, potentially from a talent availability perspective. The universities, for example, are producing IT or engineering graduates like it's gone out of fashion. The populations are declining in our home markets of Netherlands, UK, USA, where typically we hire the people, or Poland more recently. So how do you go about breaking some of those constraints and potential objections, Martin, for example, if you don't have a legal entity in Nigeria or whatever the hell it is?
Yeah. Well, look, I think a couple of things come from what you've just been talking about. Firstly, you asked if I was HR or if I was procurement. Number one thing I would say is get the two of them talking. And I've spent a lot of time in a lot of my companies, the enterprises that I've worked for, in making sure that HR and procurement engage. You have to think, particularly talent acquisition within the HR piece, they are out talking to the hiring manager who actually owns the demand every single day. And procurement can't do that. They haven't got enough people. But if you can go together, you can talk about, you can get to understand that demand side. very often procurement was leading on the contingent workforce, the external workforce side. And on the SOW, the services and the outsourcing, they are still very much leading, although the contingent side has become a lot closer. You see a lot more at SIA and ProcureCon and so on that are HR-led, and that generally means talent acquisition-led. So get those two together. And then think about third parties. We did and I worked at AIG, big insurance company. I hired our first person ever in India. I was running recruitment for the EMEA region. We did a build, operate, transfer, the first use of bot. But it was nothing to do with AI or computing. Build, operate, transfer. We used a third party to build an operation for us. They had about 50 to 100 people employed by them locally in the market. We then hired in our own leadership to come in, and then we transferred it into AIG. So if you haven't got the legal entity, think about a partnership. Think about an outsource agreement. If you're doing it from a recruitment perspective, think about the MSP and the RPO as being able to help you acquire the skill and capability that you need. I think the days of every enterprise trying to do it all themselves have been going for a long time. And here's another example where actually you can partner with somebody better as another way. It's often a better way of doing it.
I think they're great pieces of advice, Martin. So, Martin, my background, I come from the MSP and staffing sector, but with a bias towards technology and with a weird bias towards resource demand planning, in particular, and some of the more esoteric trends that are out there. But if you look at from your perspective, if you look at the MSP and staffing sector, do you feel that, do you think that they're ripe for disintermediation? And if so, what might that look like in your opinion?
I think there's ongoing change and therefore opportunity for both the MSPs and the staffing sector and the RPOs out there as well. There's been a long-term trend to, unfortunately, downhill in terms of the service that TA offers. Cost-cutting. TA within an organization will often be a large team, a large proportion of HR, and if costs have to be cut across the organization, therefore they take their share, or sometimes if they're cutting recruitment activity, a bigger share of any reductions. So TA has been at the receiving end of that for a number of years now. That's reducing the team, reducing the investment. That means reducing the experience for all of the key stakeholders. That's the employee, the hiring manager, the candidate, the rest of HR, and overall the company and the brand. There has to be opportunity to, through investment, through technology, to help streamline that. So, the use of some asynchronous in video interviewing, for example, where you get if the candidates are asking the questions, responding to the questions in their own time. You don't have to commit to a whole series of interviews. You do the interview once, you ask the questions once. Multiple candidates then see that, respond, and record their response. Whether you assess that with AI or you assess that by watching, then conducting the interviews or receiving those interviews in your time, is down to your organization and your willingness to embrace those sorts of technologies. But that has been a way to significantly deliver savings. We did that at Philips, we did that at BT, we did that at AIG. Depends on the market and the type of recruitment. Early career recruitment, absolutely prime for that, because you've got an audience of candidates who are digital natives. They're operating in that field, and they've got no issue whatsoever about talking to their phone. It's the people at our end within the enterprise that have to make more change and be more willing to embrace that change and embrace that technology, that approach.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Martin, one of the things I was thinking about there as I was listening to you was around talent acquisition practitioners. I know oftentimes when there's bad news, people suffer from, I suppose, recency bias, where you think, God, this is the worst it's ever been, or this news is relatively is relatively new. But if I think about the amount of people that I've worked with and know in talent acquisition, and you only have to go on LinkedIn, right, every single day, where you see amazing people that had amazing jobs in the TA function in large and medium-sized organizations. So many of them are open to work at the moment. And like I've been in this sector, I think, or adjacent to it for coming up to 20 years now. So I lived through the great financial crisis, particularly in Ireland, where it seemed to last about 5 years or so. But I think it was from really 2008 to 2012. It was pretty ugly over there and over here. But I don't recall seeing so many TA people out of work and open to work. And I suppose my question really is twofold. One, do you think I may be suffering from recency bias and perhaps the problem isn't as bad as what I'm presenting? And two, why do you think there's so many TA people on the market at the moment? What is happening inside the large enterprise to essentially push those people out?
First thing I'll say is this is cyclical. You've seen it in a cycle of it happening before. I've seen the cycle of it happening before. And we are right in the middle of a really tough one. And I know I left Philips recently. Since then, they've had a big staff reduction, and I'm hearing from many people in my network reflecting exactly what you've just said. Companies are having to tighten their belts, reduce costs. The world economy is not doing well. There's less recruitment going on, and therefore people target their recruitment team, which often has the biggest element of external sourcing, external recruitment. And if they're stopping, they've got a headcount freeze or they've got a workforce freeze, they'll take the very short-term decisions to save the bottom line. And many companies will say, right, we're stopping travel, we're stopping training, we're stopping recruitment. And there aren't that many easy levers, and they are easy levers. They might not be the right ones, but they're easy levers for them to pull. So I think that is impacting us, and it becomes very visible. I hope that companies are keeping some TA to focus on that gem that they have, which is their existing internal talent, and making sure that they're reskilling and redeploying them first to meet the demand. If they don't, then they're going to be hamstrung when we go towards the next phase of the cycle and things start to pick up. Maybe things will pick up in a slightly different way. Maybe we're thinking about more offshore work that still has to be recruited and managed. Maybe more partnerships and outsourcing. Maybe more of that total workforce approach. There you need people who can understand what the needs are and translate that. Recruiters are very good at that because they take the need from multiple managers and translate it to something that the candidate can understand. So could be in a very good position going forward once we get through this cycle. I think it's just, there are so many things going on in the world. You just have to look at the headlines to see why many companies are having to tighten their belts, and recruiters, talent acquisition teams and staffing agencies who face the same cut in demand are always going to be at the bottom of that.
Yeah, I agree. And it seems to me, Martin, like it seems to be the longest period though that I can recall where the market's been like this, because I think during the COVID period, if you like, so let's say 2020, 2021 into 2022, it was really an employees market, right? You had all these trends like the Great Resignation, and people could jump from one job to the next, but it seems to flip the other way, whereby the employer has the power now, and it seems to be lasting quite some time, about 3 years now, where I know so many people that have been benched in the TA space, and I'm wondering, actually, go ahead, Martin. Sorry, go ahead. I'm waxing on here.
Well, for me, and it's great to listen to because you're experiencing it as well. I think the Great Resignation never happened. Everybody thought it was going to happen.
Agreed.
Everybody was worrying about it happening, but it coincided with another change, which is then the downturn in the economy post-COVID. Everybody was elated because we managed to beat or get on top of COVID. Economics went up and then they went down again. And the Great Resignation was never materialized because the economy started going, people weren't jumping. because they were trying to hold on to their existing job. We're now getting to the end of that cycle where people are now unfortunately losing their jobs. So more and more people coming on available on the labor on the market. We need to see how this cycle is going to play out. And if some of the macroeconomic factors that are going on at the moment settle down, and some of the economic potential starts to be delivered, then you'll start to see the rise coming up. And then you've got people who can understand matching demand to talent will find themselves back being engaged, back being recruited. And the people that have held on to their teams, or at least have held the relationship with people, are going to be the ones that can maximize the upward curve when it comes.
Yeah, I agree in that latter point. I read a really interesting piece in the Atlantic magazine today, and I think they've got I can't recall, but they've got a weekly workforce or work newsletter by a guy called Derek Thompson, and I can't quite recall the author of the article, but it was called The Great Freeze, right? Another term, and I agree with you on the Great Resignation. I don't know if you've read any of Anita Letting's pieces on the Great Resignation, where she looked at the data and said, "Hey, listen, don't believe what you're hearing here on the Great Resignation." But on the Great Freeze, as the author of this particular piece coined it, essentially saying the labour market's really fascinating, and that's something I wanted to talk to you about as well today, Martin, because we've got, it looks like in most Western labour markets, full employment or close to it. That's mythical. Sorry, not mythical. That 4% figure, right? And the author of this piece was talking about his brother who couldn't get a job, just came out of grad school, really good degree he had, went for like 539 different application processes, which came down to, like, let's say 30 interviews, which came down to 0 offers, right, over that period of time. And essentially the premise or the hypothesis of the article was, listen, this ain't going to change because we've got the twin forces of recession, and we've also got the potential impact of artificial intelligence. And his view is that artificial intelligence is actually replacing some of these jobs, and therefore organizations won't actually need to augment or hire people to do certain types of jobs, particularly in sectors such as professional services. And based on this particular author's analysis, Martin, there looked to be only 2 job categories or sectors that grew in the labour market in the United States, and that was in the healthcare sector and I think the gym sector. He didn't call it that, but something like that. So that was quite interesting to me, this big freeze. I'm sure it'll take off the concept and then go away, but I'm wondering if there's some validity into what this particular author was saying, and we'll dig out the piece and link it in the show notes as well, because I can't bloody remember his name.
I like augmented intelligence. I think that AI, we should be able to look back on it and think in the day that it's now just a tool, like that spreadsheet that you have. You and I will remember the days when we used to fax. You remember a fax?
Yes, for sure.
Faxing CVs over to managers because it was slightly quicker than the post. And actually, I worked in the city at the time, and often we'd walk them round to guarantee that they got there. And people thought that the internet and email and was going to destroy jobs. They just changed jobs.
Yes,
I think that person who had those hundreds of interviews made think about the work that they want to do, and how is that changing, and how do they then apply their skills to that work. And that's a story that goes back to that right at the beginning, me leaving the military, thinking of those transferable skills. Now, that was a very different context. But if they're just coming out of grad school, they've got to think about how do they apply the skill that only they as an individual, that they as a human have, and how can the intelligence augment those skills, and to get your augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence, how you would combine with that in order and then focus on, well, that bit's going to go to the AI, and this bit is where the person is going to add the value. That's what I talk about in terms of my skills and my experience, my story, my resume, my CV.
And Martin, if we look at some of the challenges that some organizations are facing around finding talent externally, But let's say they're listening to the show or they're reading about total workforce strategy and they're reading about the rise of the skills-based organization. What advice can you provide to some organizations that want to look at the skills within their organization, or sorry, the people that have skills or can be reskilled or redeployed in an organization? What is the starting point, and what can they do to sort of unlock that untapped potential within their organizations?
So I have just done some work with on the strategic workforce planning side with Henley Business College, and they sponsored an event looking at how AI can impact strategic workforce planning. And they're going to publish a paper on it on their website soon. And they looked at the case studies of the 30 or 40 different organizations that joined the workshop, joined the day. And a lot of them, one big use case for AI within strategic workforce planning or within talent and in general was around how you can use it to identify skills. So what are the skills in your job description? Are they being reflected in your job posting? Are you then identifying those skills in the resumes, the CVs of the candidates? Are you identifying those skills within your internal workforce? Back to that point, look internally. That's the best talent you've got because you've already got it. So how are you looking at the skills of your existing workforce to understand how you can apply those skills to the work that needs to be done? And use that many were using AI to do that analysis that allowed them to understand what skills they needed and how they could then change the shape of the work to meet so that they could see that, well, the workforce we have can do this. We might partner with someone else for that. We might outsource that. We might get a bot to do that. And some of this work, we might just get rid of it completely. So I think the skills can be the basis of that, and use the enterprise can use the AI to a lot of enterprises showing the use of AI in uncovering those skills, identifying those skills, and matching the skills that they have in their existing workforce with the skills that are needed for getting the work done tomorrow.
Martin, thanks for sharing that advice. I think that's really helpful for our listeners that are considering and are probably going to be wrestling or are wrestling with some of the challenges. So, Martin, one of the things we've spoken about on the show over the last number of years is around artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence or generative intelligence, and its potential or actual impact on jobs and specifically on jobs displacement. And I suppose I've been pretty focal in that I'm quite concerned about the impact of AI, AGI, and hybrid AI on jobs. I don't see much upside actually for the jobs market, and some of the data is quite mixed in this, at least the prediction data from World Economic Forum and other sources. I suppose my question really is, what's your take on it? Do you think it's going to be helpful for the labour market and for jobs in particular?
Overall, it's going to have a big impact in that it is going to change jobs. If organizations can think about how they get the work done, they can then change the jobs to take advantage of the AI, but they will still need to have the person. So I'm not scared about it. I think AI will look back at it and think of it as a tool in the same way as we think of the internet as a tool. I know horror stories about what that was going to do to us all years ago. And you can think back about through all of the industrial revolutions that we've had, the power revolution, electricity revolution, agricultural revolution, they've all made change. And the result of all of them has been greater employment. Just harnessing the technology to change that employment.
Thank you, Martin. And Martin, I know you've worked for some large enterprises over the last number of years. I want to look at the HR technology sector. There's lots of different point solutions, if you like, in HR tech. There's probably so many that you could just run out of space to name them all. But have you seen anything on and do they all integrate and do they all talk to each other and all that? Probably not. But I suppose, Martin, I'd love to get your read on HR tech and total workforce or total talent. Have you seen any technology that's sought to bring that all together into what I've been talking about for a few years? I call this a single view, right, Martin, that gives organizations an insight into the skills, an insight into the internal talent that exists in the organization, and insight, whether that's contingent or perm, and also external talent that comes in and out of their organization. Have you seen anything that can bring all that together?
No. Simple answer.
Okay.
I think it's because the evolution of the different tools, the HRIS tools or the VMS tools, or the freelancer tools, they all come from slightly different places. And they're all very good at what they do, but they do different things. You don't use a Ferrari to move house. Doesn't mean a van is worse than a Ferrari. It just does a different job. When I've built, you talked about Martin Hansen earlier on, and he's done one of these podcasts before. He and I used to work together a few years back. He's gone on to develop really clever workforce insights, where he can take the data out of those different tools, those different sources, and then display it back. And that's what we did with business intelligence tools. We took the data out of the source systems, so your HRIS, your VMS, your manual reports, your procurement systems, your finance systems. You need to do some mapping, because some of them measure things that way and others measure them that way. You need to do the mapping so you're comparing like for like. Key lesson that I've learned is don't try and do that in any one of those systems. They're great at being a Ferrari or being a van, but they're not good at painting pictures. Put it in a business intelligence tool to display it, to show it, to bring all of those data sources. That's where you get the wow moment. You think about it, if you're in an enterprise, you have a manager who's got an HR system, they can see their employees, they all report to him, there's a leader, a manager, a leader. You can follow the chain.
Yeah.
Your contingent workers are in a different system. Maybe it's a finance system, maybe you've got a VMS, maybe it's in a spreadsheet, whatever, and they're all being billed to a certain finance cost center. And different managers will own multiple different cost centers. So you get a vertical or a horizontal view. They're both correct. If you can take the data, map it, and put it together, you can actually show a leader their workforce in one page. And that's when you get the wow. That's when they realize, I've got that many contingent workers.
Yeah.
My workforce costs me that much.
Yes. I love that, Martin.
And I don't want a system that does that.
No, same. I'm looking for one, but we'll definitely reach out. We'll definitely reach out to Martin Hansen on that. So, there's been a little bit.
Get him to come back and show you
work
on sites. That's it's a great idea of and great follow up as well, evolution of it.
Yeah, I will, Martin. We'll do that, and I think he is speaking at one of our events this week. So, hopefully, he'll give us a little teaser of what that looks like, Martin. I'm sure he will be. But Martin, one of the topics I want to look at briefly, if we can, is the topic of remote work, and specifically on some of the return to office mandates that they've been described. What are your thoughts on return to office mandates, and also specifically on remote work? Do you think it's a good thing for knowledge workers, typically who are the main beneficiaries of it? Because it's really difficult, of course, for a police officer or a nurse to do remote work as it currently stands.
And the first point I was going to make is this only some people, some of the workforce has never had the opportunity to be remote. And most of the workforce never had the opportunity to be remote, and none of us thought it could happen. Wasn't it wonderful when you could have a Friday afternoon working from home? And then suddenly everybody was working from home, and we realized that actually it is also quite possible. So I think there's not one answer. There's some people have to be on site, manufacturing things, on the beat, driving the car, driving the bus, whatever it might be. Some people are able to be remote if that's the nature of their work. Maybe they're delivering services remote online, 24-hour on call, whatever, call center, whatever it might be. I think there's a large population where there is benefit of both, and that for me is the right answer. study coming out of Wharton University that says, looking at all of the big enterprises, so not necessarily smaller companies, the 3 day a week model of you want you present doing something that's meaningful up to 3 days, and then flexible on the other days. Flexible for somebody might be in the office. We are big populations who maybe don't have somewhere where they can work from, and we have to think about it. I think of some of your early career people. Perhaps they don't have space in the accommodation where they live to have a desk that isn't, perhaps they are working off the end of their bed, and actually just being in an office in a desk in a slightly healthier environment, and separate from, their home environment. We have to allow for that. So not one size fits all. There are different constituents in that who have different needs, but I think flexibility is the key. I don't agree with anybody who's saying every knowledge worker has to be in 5 days a week. I think that's short-sighted, and actually a little bit weak leadership and weak management. If you don't trust your people to do the work, then I don't think you're leading or managing them well enough.
I completely concur with that last point, Martin. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think if you trust your people and you lead your people to be self-leaders, then you never need to worry about someone working from home. I don't think
you need clarity of what is expected. Yeah, what's expected of them, what are their deliverables. Trust them, because you've done a good recruitment job and a good coaching and leadership management job. Trust them. Be clear about the deliverables. Trust them to do it.
Yeah, I agree. And Martin, I've thoroughly enjoyed the topics we've discussed today, and I'm glad we spent some time on some of them, particularly on the strategic workforce piece and total workforce strategies. I find that absolutely fascinating. But I'd like to finish, Martin, with a question that we ask all of our guests, which is, what is your prediction or predictions for the future of work, Martin?
Well, that's a tough one. I think, and maybe I hope, that we'll look back and realize what a useful tool AI is alongside all the other tools that we have available to us. And it will just become part of that toolkit.
I love that, Martin. So, Martin, thanks so much for joining our show. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
No, it's been great, Martin. And thank you for making the time for our audience and for myself. And I have really enjoyed, and I feel that I've learned a lot, and I think our audience and listenership will have learned a lot from our conversation today. I really appreciate your time. Martin, where is the best place for our audience to come and talk to you about total workforce strategies and the amazing work that you're doing at your company and consultancy, Workforce Strategy?
You can find me on LinkedIn. That's a great starting point for anyone. And either through Workforce Strategy or through the Talent Intelligence Collective.
Martin, thanks so much, and really look forward to continuing these sort of conversations. I've had my fanboy moment here, Martin, and I'm really pleased that you came on the show, and thanks so much for making the time. I'm serious. Thanks a million, as we say in Ireland. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Connor. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Open Talent Report with Connor Heaney. If you found this podcast informative and engaging, make sure you subscribe, tell your friends, and follow us on all your favorite streaming platforms.